For centuries, Christians have assumed Jesus spoke both the parable of the sower and the explanation that follows it. But modern historical scholarship paints a much more intriguing picture. In fact, many scholars believe the explanation wasn't spoken by the historical Jesus at all. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. When we're looking at the parable of the sower, the parable itself is wonderfully open-ended. A farmer scatters seed across different kinds of soil, and each produces a different outcome. It's vivid, it's earthy, and universal. You don't have to be religious to appreciate it because it invites reflection rather than demanding some sort of dogmatic agreement. You can read it as a story about learning, or about resilience or opportunity. It could be a story about character or even luck. And like all great poetry, it leaves room for you to wrestle with its meaning. Then comes the explanation, and suddenly everything changes. So let's dive into that in this episode of Afterthoughts. All right, I'd like to begin by going back and reading two passages from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this is from the Gospel reading that we covered in the main episode of the podcast this week. So first, we'll hear the parable of the sower, which is Matthew chapter 13, verses 3 through 9. Then we'll skip ahead and read verses 18 through 23, where Jesus supposedly explains exactly what the parable means. Okay, so here's Matthew 13, verses 3 through 9, and I want you to listen carefully to the differences in these two passages. Here's the first one. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seeds fell on rich soil and produced fruit, 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. And now here's Matthew chapter 13, verses 18 through 23, which is the explanation of the parable. Hear then the parable of the sower. The seed sown on the path is the one who hears the word of the kingdom without understanding it, and the evil one comes and steals away what was sown in his heart. The seed sown on rocky ground is the one who hears the word and receives it at once with joy, but he has no root and lasts only for a time. When some tribulation or persecution comes because of the word, he immediately falls away. The seed sown among thorns is the one who hears the word, but then worldly anxiety and the lure of riches choke the word, and it bears no fruit. But the seed sown on rich soil is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Now, did you notice how different those two passages feel? Right? In the second one, the birds become the devil. Right? They're stealing the word off that falls on the path. Right? The rocky soil becomes a particular kind of believer. The thorns become wealth and worldly worries. The good soil becomes the people who believe the right things and produce the right results. So instead of an invitation to think it starts to sound like an answer key. Every symbol has only one approved meaning, and the listener's job is no longer to explore the story, but to just accept the official interpretation. Now, as I said, Christians have generally assumed Jesus spoke both the parable and the explanation, but instead, the explanation likely reflects the concerns of an early Christian community that was writing this down decades after Jesus was assumed to have been executed. In other words, this was likely edited by a community that was trying to preserve unity during a time of conflict or maybe a time of uncertainty. If that's true, well, then something remarkable happened. A story that encouraged people to think for themselves was transformed into a lesson about thinking correctly. And by correctly, I mean thinking the way that specific religious leaders at that time wanted them to think. And that raises a fascinating question. Who benefits when a powerful story is no longer allowed to speak for itself? So, you might be wondering, how do scholars arrive at this conclusion, right, that the explanation may not have come from Jesus himself? Well, they don't just guess. Right? They use a collection of historical methods known as higher criticism. And one branch, called redaction criticism, asks a pretty simple question. What did later editors change, add, or reshape, and why? So instead of treating the Bible as a book that fell from heaven fully formed, redaction criticism studies it as a library of writings that were compiled, edited, and expanded by real communities who were responding to real historical pressures. So one clue is the language itself. The explanation introduces vocabulary that sounds much more like the concerns of the early church than like the voice of an itinerant Jewish teacher walking through rural Galilee. Phrases like the word of the kingdom, well, that reflects the preaching language of later Christian communities. Even specific Greek terms, which obviously I didn't read the Greek, but this comes from the Greek version, terms such as proskyros, meaning someone who endures only briefly, and apate, the deceitfulness of wealth. Terms like that fit the pastoral struggles of those second-generation believers who were trying to keep congregations together through persecution and discouragement, and sometimes even through prosperity. These aren't random word choices. They point toward a different historical setting. They aren't words that Jesus, the historical Jesus, assuming there was one, would have used in his time. But the strongest evidence may be the structure of the passage itself. There is a world of difference between a parable and an allegory. A parable is really an invitation. It opens a window and asks you to look, to reflect, to wrestle with what you see. An allegory, on the other hand, is more like a coded puzzle. Every symbol has one correct meaning. The birds equal the devil. The rocky soil equals shallow believers. The thorns equal worldly distractions. Once you've memorized the code, well, the conversation is over. You don't really have to think about the parable anymore. Now, that distinction has been recognized for more than a century by some very prominent biblical scholars whose names I'm not even going to try to pronounce. But these scholars argued that Jesus' parables were intentionally provocative and open-ended. The parables challenged listeners to think rather than handing them some nice, neat little theological checklist. Allegorical explanations, on the other hand, are exactly what institutions create when they need consistency. If everyone can interpret a story differently, well, authority becomes very difficult to maintain. But if the official explanation is placed on Jesus' own lips, well, debate effectively ends. That's why so many historical scholars see the explanation not as the key to the parable of the sower, but as evidence of how the early church gradually transformed a living conversation into an authorized interpretation. Now, to understand why this may have happened, we need to step into the world of the late first century. Right? Think about it. Jesus had been dead for decades. The temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, shattering the center of Jewish religious life. Christian communities were just scattered across the empire, cut off from one another by distance and persecution and cultural differences. They weren't a single unified church. They just weren't. We know this historically. They were a loose network of groups who were all just trying to survive. That uncertainty created all kinds of problems. Some believers, meaning of Jesus' teachings, if you've ever been part of an organization that's going through any sort of major crisis, you know how quickly people begin asking, well, who's really in charge and who gets to decide what's true? So it's in that environment that the explanation of the parable begins to make sense. Right? Imagine you're a church leader trying to hold this fragile community together. An open-ended story that everyone interprets differently might be inspiring, but it's also kind of risky. And if every congregation reaches a different conclusion, well, unity becomes very hard to maintain. The temptation is to replace ambiguity with certainty. So, what better way to settle the debate than to put the new official interpretation into Jesus' own mouth? Instead of inviting listeners to wrestle with the story, the explanation tells them exactly how to understand it. The different soils just become categories of believers. Some are faithful, others are weak, still others are consumed by wealth or worldly concerns. The message is no longer, think deeply about this. The message becomes, here's the correct interpretation and here's where you fit. So that shift accomplishes something very important for an institution. It creates clear boundaries. It identifies insiders and outsiders. It encourages conformity while discouraging alternative interpretations. The parable stops being a conversation starter and becomes more of a diagnostic tool for measuring whether members are responding in the approved way. Now, it's important to be fair. The leaders who shaped Matthew's gospel were probably not cartoon villains plotting to seize power. They were trying to preserve a movement they believed was worth saving. But history shows us that institutions often solve crises by narrowing interpretation and by centralizing authority. We see it in governments, we see it in political parties, in corporations, and definitely in religious organizations. The irony is kind of hard to miss. A story that may have begun, that was likely to have begun as an invitation to examine the condition of our own lives, was transformed into a test of institutional loyalty. In trying to protect the movement, the early church may also have tamed one of Jesus' most provocative stories, trading the freedom to explore its meaning for the security of a single authorized answer. If you're an atheist, or a secular humanist, this discussion probably won't come as much of a surprise. The Bible to you looks very much like what you'd expect from a collection of ancient human writings. Stories preserved, edited, expanded, and sometimes reshaped to meet the needs of communities that were facing real historical challenges. Rather than weakening the text, I think that makes it a bit more interesting. It reminds us that institutions, religious or otherwise, have a habit of taking powerful, open-ended ideas and refining them into tools that preserve unity, authority, and organizational stability. The important lesson extends well beyond Christianity, though. Political movements do it. Corporations do it. Hell, even families do it. A complicated story becomes a simple slogan. A question becomes an answer. An invitation to think becomes an expectation to agree. It's one of the oldest patterns in human history, and recognizing it is one of the best defenses against manipulation, regardless of where it comes from. But if you're an open-minded Christian, I hope you'll hear something different. This isn't an argument against Jesus. If anything, it's an invitation to take him more seriously as a teacher. A storyteller doesn't need to explain every symbol, because the point of a parable isn't to eliminate uncertainty. The point of a parable is to create uncertainty. The uncertainty is where reflection begins. The doctrine of biblical inerrancy can unintentionally flatten that entire experience. If every verse must be read as a perfectly accurate transcript, then the explanation has to come from Jesus, even if the historical evidence suggests otherwise. But if we allow the possibility that later communities preserved his stories while occasionally interpreting them through their own circumstances, then the parable becomes incredibly alive again. We aren't forced to memorize the answer key. Instead, we're invited to wrestle with the story for ourselves. Personally, I find that version of Jesus far more compelling. Not a lecturer handing out the official interpretation, but this idea that maybe he was a gifted teacher who trusted ordinary people enough to let them think, question, and discover wisdom for themselves. Whether you're religious or not, I think that's an approach that's worth preserving, not just for ancient parables, but for every important conversation that we have today. Look, if the scholarship is correct, then one of Jesus' most beautiful parables underwent an unfortunate transformation. What may have begun as this open invitation to reflect on human growth gradually became a test of doctrinal correctness. A living conversation was turned into an official interpretation, replacing the freedom to explore with the organizational's security of certainty. Now that pattern, as I've said, isn't unique to Christianity. Every institution faces the temptation to exchange curiosity for conformity. Religious organizations, political parties, media ecosystems, even social movements can begin with bold, creative ideas and then slowly harden them into unquestionable orthodoxy. It's understandable. Certainty tends to hold groups together, but it also comes at a cost. The real challenge then isn't deciding whether we're the good soil or the thorny soil according to someone else's checklist. The real challenge is to ask ourselves a much more personal question. What kind of soil am I cultivating today? That's a question no institution can answer for you. Your character isn't fixed. Your capacity for compassion, curiosity, integrity, and wisdom isn't determined by a label someone assigned you decades ago. Like any healthy garden, your inner life requires continual care. You can remove weeds of prejudice. You can loosen the hard ground of certainty. You can make room for new ideas to take root. And that's the responsibility this parable still offers us, even after 2,000 years. Don't let anyone, whether they're wearing a robe, a business suit, or a campaign button, don't let anyone freeze your mind into someone else's approved interpretation of the world. Keep cultivating the soil of your own character. That's where growth begins. And that's where genuine human freedom flourishes. All right, thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. If you subscribe for free over at the Coda Project, you'll start receiving my publication called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for each age group. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to the Guide to Kitchen Table Activism, which is a detailed resource designed to help you be politically active from your own home. The guide explains why activism is important, the philosophy behind kitchen table activism, and the foundational values it supports, before laying out how to use the tools you have to make your voice heard. It provides tools, tactics, and templates for you to use, and it only takes 15 minutes a week. If you care about our democracy, our country, and our world, then I encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember to question everything, keep what's good, and live what matters.